Good evening to our viewers and to our special guest, Anna Applebaum. A big thanks for being with us tonight to mark the European Day of Remembrance for the victims of all totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. This Remembrance Day, 23rd of August, was proposed in a resolution of the European Parliament in April 2009, based on the anniversary of the signature of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and its secret protocols on 23rd of August 1939, in which Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union divided Europe into two spheres of interest. The House of European History has been organizing a series of lectures and debates to commemorate the victims of totalitarian and authoritarian regimes. These include regular events for the commemoration of International Holocaust Remembrance Day, panel debates about the interaction and mutual influence of memories of various victim groups, or events in partnerships with prominent European memory networks. The House of European History's permanent exhibition shows the atrocities committed during Europe's 20th century alongside each other. Genocides, mass executions, deportations, terror, persecution of opponents, under National Socialism, under Stalinism, in the communist countries after Stalin's death, under the southern dictatorships, but also outside of Europe, in Europe's colonies. This joint presentation is not meant to equalize these crimes committed by states, but to compare the mechanisms used to base their power on brutal oppression and annihilation of their victims. In this European overview of the bloodiest century of history that the museum presents, the sufferings of millions can be recognized and commemorated, whilst also shining a light on parts of the continent in a place where they were less known beforehand. In our museum, we also draw attention to the ways in which the memory of these atrocities has been instrumentalized, used and abused, and how it has given rise to vicious memory wars. In our current temporary exhibition, in which we explore the long history of fakes and forgeries, we dedicate a whole chapter to the Katyn massacres and to the decades-long struggles to uncover the truth about those crimes. The museum's creation, therefore, is part of the process, intensified since the fall of the Iron Curtain, of uncovering unknown facts, of comparing and confronting memories, of addressing the multifaceted and multidimensional perspective, and of acknowledging each other's pasts. For today's commemoration, the House of European History has invited renowned Pulitzer Prize winning historian and journalist Anna Applebaum. She will speak about the crimes of Stalin. What do we know and why it matters? 30 years after the opening of the Soviet archives, she will ask, how have our views of Soviet history changed? How can these revelations help us understand the dangers and divisive nature of violent ideologies and authoritarianism? From these learnings, how can we better recognize the risks associated with misinformation and abuse of power in leadership? Anna Applebaum has won multiple awards for her research and publications about the Stalinist and communist past. In her latest book, Twilight of Democracy, Anne outlines why elites and democracies around the world are turning towards nationalism and authoritarianism. Anne is a senior fellow of international affairs and Agora fellow in residence at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Anne was named recently one of the top 50 thinkers of the COVID-19 age by Prospect Magazine. We are very proud and honored to have her with us today. To our viewers, feel free to comment or post questions in the chat box. As always, we will make time for a question and answer session following Anna's lecture. This discussion will be moderated by curator Joanna Urbanek. And now I will hand over to Anna. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the House of History for choosing to commemorate this day. I do think that it's evidence of how the addition of the former communist countries to the European Union has changed the way that Europeans talk about history. And I'm really pleased to be part of that process as we begin to look at the history of the continent as a whole and not just from Western perspectives. But although the legacy of Stalin's crimes will be the subject of my talk today, I will begin with a brief account of what we have learned about at least two Soviet crimes since the breakup of the Soviet Union. In other words, what we know now, in other words, that we did not know 30 years ago. For I've never wanted to claim that in writing either my narrative history of the Gulag or my book about the Ukrainian famine, that I discovered new topics that had never been touched on before. To take one famous example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, the history of the camp system that he published in the 1970s, largely got it right. Although he had no access to archives, and although he based all of his writing on the letters and memoirs of other prisoners, he did, it now appears, understand the basic outline of Gulag history from its earliest incarnation on the Sovietsky Islands in the White Sea, and as it spread across the far north and then across the country. But in the years I spent researching my Gulag book, I did come to the conclusion that archives can make a difference to how we understand Soviet history, and more broadly, why historical research should and can and should shape our understanding of events. To be clear, it now sounds, now that we're in another era of repression and difficulties with research in Russia, I should make it clear that I was able to work in archives in Moscow and Karelia. This is in the 1990s. I had access to documents from archives in St. Petersburg, in Perm, in Vorkuta, in Kolyma, and Novosibirsk. At one point in my research, in the years I was working on this book, I was handed a part of an archive of a small camp called Kudrovy Shore in the far north, and I was politely asked if I wanted to buy it, which I did. I later donated it to an archive. What was available to me then was quite ordinary often. The day-to-day archive of the Gulag administration, for example, with inspectors' reports, financial accounts, letters from the camp directors to their supervisors in Moscow. But when reading these documents, the full extent of the system and its importance to the Soviet economy and to the Soviet terror system came sharply into focus. And certainly, for example, these documents enabled me to be far more precise than it was ever possible to be in the past. Thanks to archives, we now know, for example, that there were at least 476 camp systems in the Soviet Union, each one made up of hundreds or even thousands of individual camps or lagpunkts. Sometimes they were spread out over thousands of square miles of otherwise empty tundra. We know they existed in every corner of the Soviet Union, not just the far north. Although some of us are familiar with the image of the prisoner in the pickaxe and in the snowstorm digging coal, there were also camps in central Moscow where prisoners built apartment blocks or designed airplanes. There were camps in Krasnoyarsk where prisoners ran nuclear power plants. There were fishing camps on the Pacific coast. The Gulag photo albums in the Russian state archives are chock full of pictures of prisoners with their camels. So from Akhtubinsk to Yakutsk, there was actually not a single major population center in the Soviet Union that did not have its own local camp or camps, and not a single industry that did not employ prisoners. And over the years, prisoners built roads, railroads, power plants, and chemical factories. They manufactured weapons and furniture and even children's toys. And that means that in the Soviet Union of the 1940s, which was actually the decade the camps reached their zenith, it would have been difficult in many places to go about your daily business and not run into prisoners. It's therefore no longer possible to argue, as some Western historians once did, that the camps were known only to a small portion of the population. And we also know that the vast majority of prisoners in these camps were peasants and workers, not the intellectuals who later wrote the memoirs and books. We know that with a few exceptions, the camps were not constructed in order to kill people, because Stalin preferred to use firing squads to conduct his mass executions. Nevertheless, they were at times very lethal. Nearly a quarter of the Gulag's prisoners died during the war years. They were also very fluid. Prisoners left because they died, because they escaped, because they had short sentences, because they were being released into the Red Army, or sometimes because they were promoted from prisoner to guard. There were also frequent amnesties for the old, for the ill, for pregnant women, and for anyone else who was no longer useful to the forced labor system. But these releases were invariably followed by new waves of arrests. As a result of this system, between 1929, when they first became a mass phenomenon, and 1953, the year of Stalin's death, some 18 million people passed through the Soviet Gulag. In addition, a further 6 or 7 million people were deported, not to camps, but to exile villages. And in total, that means that the number of people with some experience of imprisonment in Stalin's Soviet Union could have run as high as 25 million, or about 15% of the population. But thanks to archives, I can also now speak with the same kind of precision about another Soviet tragedy. This is the tragedy of the great Soviet famine of the early 1930s, and also in particular of the Ukrainian famine, known as the Holodomor, that was a distinct part of it. Again, Ukrainian stories and diaries and accounts have been preserved from that time. Ukrainian oral history recorded sometimes as soon as the 1940s, immediately after the war, always told us that there had been a terrible famine in Ukraine in that era. The historian Robert Conquest was able to write a book using those kinds of sources, describing the famine and its impact in the 1980s. But again, although we've known that the broader famine was the result of a policy of collectivization and deportation, which the peasants across the USSR resisted and for which they were punished, archives also have shown us how in the autumn of 1932, the Soviet Politburo, the elite leadership of the Soviet Communist Party, took in addition a series of decisions that deliberately widened and deepened the famine in the Ukrainian countryside. So even as people were going hungry, they increased the state's demand for food from Ukraine and from Ukrainian farmers. They refused to halt the export of grain, which continued all through that year because Stalin considered hard currency critical to his program of industrialization. They also, as Ukrainian peasants began to starve, they blocked the roads between the countryside and the cities. Eventually, they prohibited Ukrainian peasants from traveling to Russia or to Belarus in search of food. At the height of the crisis, organized teams of policemen and party activists, motivated themselves by hunger and by fear and by a decade of hateful and conspiratorial rhetoric, entered peasant households and took everything edible: potatoes, beets, squash, beans, peas, anything in the oven or anything in the cupboard. They took farm animals, they took pets, sometimes they took money and clothes. And the result was a catastrophe. Within weeks of Stalin's orders, Ukrainian peasants began eating horses, dogs, cats, rats. They ate the bark of oak trees, they ate moss and acorns, leaves and dandelions. They killed crows and pigeons and sparrows. The death rates eventually spiked in the spring of 1933. That was when Ukrainian peasants died in large numbers in their homes and their yards, leaving their villages spookily empty. They traveled to the railways trying to get out. They died in stations. They tried to work and died in the fields. They died in such large numbers that there was often nobody to bury them. And the numbers, for that reason, of deaths remain controversial, although we now know the numbers were probably between 3 and 4 million. What I'm telling you both about the famine, is just like what I told you about the Gulag, is not entirely new. Not only are there accounts from before the archives were opened, there are, in the case of these stories and many others, more recent works written in regional language describing what happened. All of my work on the Gulag and on the famine and on the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, in fact, relied very heavily on locally and especially Russian sources, including the work of some excellent Russian historians who have used their own archives with great care, who've published documents, who've cooperated with Ukrainian authorities, with Baltic and Polish authorities, and who've worked closely together with Western historians, also to tell the history of their country. So what I'm telling you, in other words, is not unknown to Russia or to Russian historians. And yet the question has to be asked, why are these aspects of history not better known in Russia itself? One of the things that always strikes contemporary visitors to Russia is the lack of monuments to Stalin's victims. There are a few scattered memorials, but there's no national monument or place of mourning. And the absence of monuments does, I'm afraid, accurately indicate an absence of public awareness. It's true that there were wide-ranging discussions of Soviet repression in the late 1980s during Gorbachev's reign. And it's equally true that these discussions played an important role in delegitimizing the Soviet regime. But the bitter debate about justice for the victims is now over. And unfortunately, it left no real political institutions in its wake. So although there was much talk about it at the end of the 1980s, the Russian government never did examine or try the perpetrators of torture or mass murder, even those who were identifiable. There were no truth commissions or public conversations of the sort implemented in South Africa or other countries, which might have allowed victims to tell their stories in an official public space and to make the crimes of the past a part of the public debate. The reason the impact of these stories are, as a result, not felt by ordinary people. They aren't known. They're sometimes part of school history reports, but school history classes, but not always. At some level, the reasons for this are not hard to fathom. The Stalinist era was a long time ago, and a great deal has happened since it ended. Post-Soviet Russia is not the same as post-Nazi Germany, where the memories of the worst atrocities were still in people's minds. There's a complication in Russia, which is that the memory of the camps and of the famine is also confused in Russia by the presence of so many other atrocities and so many other kinds of memories of the war, for example, or collectivization and its more general impacts. So why should camp survivors get special treatment? It is further confused by the link that's made in some people's minds between that discussion of the past that took place in the 1980s and the collapse of the Soviet economy that took place in the 1990s. So what was the point of talking about all of that? Many people have said to me in Russia, it got us nowhere. There's also a question of pride. Many people, particularly in Russia, although not only, but particularly in Russia, experienced the collapse of the Soviet Union as a kind of personal blow. So perhaps the old system was bad, they now feel, but at least we were powerful. And now that we are not powerful, we don't want to hear that it was bad. Still, the most important explanation for the lack of debate inside Russia is not the fears and anxieties of ordinary Russians, but the nature of the country's current ruling class. So Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, is a former KGB officer who has described himself as a Chekist, so deliberately using the word for Lenin's hated political police. Famously, the Russian president has also described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, presumably meaning greater than World Wars I or II. Under his watch, Soviet flags have returned to anniversary parades, the Soviet national anthem has been revived, and the cult, not so much of the Second World War, but of the moment of victory, of the moment of supreme Soviet imperial triumph in 1945, has been revived. So in other words, this is the moment that the Russian government chooses to celebrate as its high moment of national pride, when there were Soviet troops all across Eastern Europe, including in Berlin, including in Poland, including in the Baltic states. And that for them remains a high point of the past and a kind of lodestone, a moment to turn to and remember. These changes, this insistence on that moment being the most important piece of the past, has of course a lot more to do with the present than it does, and the needs of the current government than it does to do with the needs of Russians. Thus, for Putin, 1989 needs to be shown not as a moment of liberation, but as the beginning of economic collapse. The hardships and deprivations of the 1990s need to be also demonstrated not as the result of decades of communist neglect and widespread theft, but of Western-style capitalism and democracy. Putin needs to explain that communism was stable and safe and triumphant, and post-communism was a disaster. The Soviet Union at its imperial height was great. Russia, at least until he came to power, was a failure. The more people believe this, the less likely they are to want a political system in Russia, which is more genuinely democratic and genuinely capitalist. The more nostalgia for Soviet-era symbols, the more secure his KGB-dominated government is likely to be. The failure to examine the long-term consequences of Soviet policy towards Ukraine also have an explanation in the needs of the present regime as well. Really, from the time of the Russian Revolution, The Bolsheviks, inside Ukraine, knew that they were a minority. And to subjugate the majority, they used not only extreme violence, but also virulent and angry forms of propaganda. So the Holodomor in Ukraine was preceded by a decade of what we would now call hate speech, language designating some people as loyal Soviet citizens and others as enemy kulaks, a privileged class that would have to be destroyed to make way for the People's Revolution. That ideological language justified the behavior of the men and women who facilitated the famine, the people who confiscated food from starving families, the policemen who arrested and killed their fellow citizens. It also provided them with a sense of moral and political justification. Very few of the men and women who organized the famine ever felt guilty about having done so. They had been persuaded that the dying peasants were enemies of the people, dangerous criminals who had to be eliminated in the name of progress. 80 years later, the Russian FSB, the institutional successor of the KGB, continues to demonize its opponents using this kind of propaganda and disinformation. So the nature and the form of hate speech has changed, but the intentions of those who use it has not. So as in the past, the Kremlin used language to set people against one another, to create first and second class citizens, to divide and distract. In 2014, Russian state media described Russian special forces carrying out the invasion of Crimea and of eastern Ukraine as separatist patriots fighting fascists and Nazis from Kiev. An extraordinary disinformation campaign, complete with fake stories, for example, that Ukrainian nationalists had crucified a baby, and fake photographs followed not only inside Russia, but on Russian state-sponsored media around the world. Of course, this was far more sophisticated than anything Stalin could have devised in an era before electronic media, but the spirit of that disinformation campaign was much the same. I would argue that the failure to repent, to discuss, or even to dwell on the past is part of what makes these changes in Russian public culture possible. Part of why it's possible to celebrate Stalinism without acknowledging the Gulag. Part of why it's possible to demonize modern Ukraine without remembering the Holodomor is precisely because these events are not remembered, they're not discussed, they're not part of public culture. But this is more than a problem just for Russia's neighbors. I would also argue this is a problem for Russians, for the formation of Russian civil society, for the development of rule of law in Russia. The lack of consciousness, the lack of knowledge of the past helps explain, for example, why so many Russians are not bothered by certain kinds of censorship, or by the FSB's ability to open mail or tap telephones or enter private residences without a court order. All of these are the kinds of actions, the kind of rights that the KGB had in the past. It helps explain why we now have a return of political trials and harsh sentences, why independent media has been effectively banned, why there are new restrictions on who is allowed to speak, why journalists and others are now being called foreign agents, which means that they have restrictions on them and they're treated as enemies, why political opposition is impossible, and actually why injustice is still so rampant. Leaving politics aside, the unfairness of Soviet life has persisted into modern Russia. So just to give you an example, some years ago, I visited a criminal prison in Arkhangelsk in Russia. And I really emerged reeling from what I'd seen. You know, I was inside these women's cells with very hot air and, kind of overwhelming stench. And they really made me feel as I had walked back into the past, into the descriptions of cells that I'd read from Gulag memoirs from the 1930s. And in one of the juvenile cells, I met a sobbing 15-year-old girl who'd been accused of stealing the ruble equivalent of $10. And she had been in jail without a hearing for a week. Afterwards, I spoke to the prison boss and he told me, oh, it's all about money. The prison warders are rude because they're badly paid. The ventilation is bad because the building is old and needed repairs. Electricity is expensive, so the corridors are dark. Trials are delayed because there aren't enough judges. And I really wasn't convinced. Money is a problem, but it's not the whole story. If Russia's prisons look like a scene from a Gulag memoir, if Russia's courts and criminal investigations increasingly look like Stalinist era kangaroo courts. That's partly because the Soviet legacy does not haunt Russia's criminal police, its secret police, its judges, its jailers, or its businessmen or its shopkeepers. Very few people in Russia, in contemporary Russia, feel the past to be a burden or an obligation at all. And unfortunately, I fear that that means it's like a great unopened Pandora's box, lying in wait for another generation. But do we in the West, or do we in Europe, I should say to this audience, do we remember the Soviet past any better? One of the reasons I wrote my Gulag book was really because I encountered that subject only while living in Eastern Europe. And I started to wonder why. Later on, the reason I wrote about the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, why I wrote about Ukraine, was because I also felt these subjects were insufficiently understood by European audiences. Until recently, it was possible to explain the absence of popular feeling about the tragedy of European communism as the logical result of a particular set of circumstances, this lack of feeling in Germany, in France, in America. And of course, the passage of time was part of it. Communist regimes really did grow less reprehensible as the years went by. Nobody was very frightened of General Jaruzelski or even of Brezhnev, although both of them were responsible for a great deal of destruction. Besides, those archives that I was able to use were closed. Access to Soviet campsites were forbidden. No television cameras ever filmed the Soviet camps or their victims as they had done in Germany at the end of the Second World War. There were very few images of the Ukrainian famine. I think I used almost all of them in my book. There's just less than a dozen. But no images in turn meant that the subject in our image-driven culture didn't really exist either. Of course, ideology or politics, I should say, twisted the way in which we understood Soviet and East European history as well. In fact, in the 1920s, a great deal was known in Europe and America about the bloodiness of Lenin's revolution. European socialists, many of whose brethren had been jailed by the Bolsheviks, did protest quite loudly and strongly against the crime of the Russian Revolution. In the 1930s, however, as Americans and West Europeans became more interested in learning how socialism could be applied at home, the tone changed. Writers and journalists went off to the Soviet Union trying to learn lessons they could use at home. The New York Times famously employed a correspondent, Walter Duranty, who covered up the Ukrainian famine knowingly, and also argued against the evidence that Soviet collectivization was a massive success. And I'm afraid he won a Pulitzer Prize for doing so. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, a part of the Western political scene, especially on the left, although not only, struggled to explain and sometimes to excuse Soviet crimes and the terror that created them, precisely because they wanted to try some aspects of the Soviet experiment at home. Our determination to ignore Soviet crimes solidified even further during the Second World War, when Stalin was the ally of several Western nations. So in 1944, the American Vice President, Henry Wallace, actually went to Kolyma, one of the most notorious camps, during a trip across the Soviet Union. Imagining he was visiting some kind of industrial complex, he told his host that Soviet Asia, as he called it, reminded him of the Wild West. So the vast expanses of your country, her virgin forests, wide rivers and large lakes, all kinds of climate from tropical to polar, her inexhaustible wealth remind me of my homeland. According to a report that the boss of Kolyma later wrote for Beria, who was then the head of the Soviet security services, Wallace did ask to see prisoners, but he was kept away. He was not alone in refusing to see the truth about Stalin's system. Roosevelt and Churchill had their photographs taken with Stalin too. All of that contributed to the Western, American, British, French, Dutch conviction that the Second World War was a wholly just war. And even today, very few want that conviction shaken. You know, we remember D-Day, we remember the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps, the children welcoming American GIs with cheers on the streets. And we don't necessarily remember that the camps of Stalin, who was our wartime ally, expanded just as the camps of Hitler, who was our enemy, were liberated. Nobody wants to think that we defeated one mass murderer with the help of another. During the Cold War, it's true, our awareness of Soviet atrocities went up, but in the 1960s, they receded again. Even in the 1980s, when I was at university, there were still American academics who were describing the advantages of East German healthcare or Polish peace initiatives as if they were somehow something to be idealized or aimed for. In those days, in the academic world, Soviet historians who are Western historians who wrote about the Soviet Union generally divided into two groups: those who wrote about the camps or the crimes of Stalin, and those who downplayed them, if not because they were actually pro-Soviet, but because they were opposed to America's role in the Cold War or maybe Ronald Reagan. And I'm telling you this because it means that right up until the very end, Western American, Western European views of the Soviet Union and of its repressive system always had a lot more to do with Western politics and Western ideological struggles than they did with the Soviet Union itself. They were about us, not about them. So our understanding of Eastern Europe very much derived from Western European political battles and arguments. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, much has changed, and much has changed for the better, as your institute and as this commemoration of this important day reminds us. You know, World War II now belongs to a previous generation. The Cold War is over as well, and the alliances and fault lines that it produced have shifted, I think, for good. Western left and the Western right, such as they are, I've written several times about how those terms don't even mean anything anymore, but to the extent that they do, they now fight over other issues. Finally, it has become possible for us to stop looking at the history of the Soviet Union through the narrow lens of Western politics. It is possible and it is necessary. As I said when I began this lecture, using the sources, using the history, helps us to avoid the politicization of history that both we've fallen victim to in the past, and the Russians do now. And it's true, of course, that our tolerance for the occasional gulag denier in our universities won't destroy the moral fabric of our society, or that the ongoing fashion for hammer and sickle t-shirts won't corrupt our youth for good. But it's nevertheless important that to incorporate what we now know about the Gulag, about the Holodomor, about the other crimes of Stalin into our own memory of Europe. Because if we don't, there are consequences. After all, it is part of our history too. Why did we fight the Cold War after all? Was it because crazed right-wing politicians in cahoots with the military-industrial complex and the CIA invented the whole thing and forced two generations of Americans and Europeans to go along with it? Or was there something more important happening? I'm not sure that we still remember what it was that mobilized us, what inspired us, and what held this civilization of the West, as we used to call it, together for so long. It's worth looking at that history again to remember why, and to remember what it was that, how that part of history shaped who we are today. At the same time, it's my belief that if we don't continue to study the history of the crimes of Stalin, some of what we know about mankind itself will be distorted. I liked what you said in your introductory remarks, what was said in the introductory remarks about the way a modern museum of European history needs to show the multiple crimes alongside one another, not to argue about who was worse, but so that we can understand how they fit together, how they compare. Each one of the 20th century's mass tragedies was unique, whether the Gulag, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, the Armenian massacre, the Chinese Cultural Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, the Bosnian Wars. Every one of these events had different historical and philosophical origins, and they arose in circumstances that will never be repeated. It's only our ability to debase and destroy and dehumanize our fellow men that has been, and I fear will be, repeated again and again. It's our transformation of our neighbors into enemies, our reinvention of our victims as lower or lesser or evil beings, worthy only of incarceration or expulsion or death. The more that we understand about how different societies manage to transform their neighbors and fellow citizens into objects, And the more we know of the specific circumstances which led to each episode of mass murder, the better we will understand the darker side of our own human nature. So I wrote my books about the Gulag and the Holodomor, not so that it will not happen again, as the cliche has it, but because it almost certainly will happen again. And we need to know why. And each story and each document and each memoir is a piece of the puzzle. Without them, we will wake up one day and realize that we don't know who we are. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak to you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this fascinating, very concise lecture. During those 30 minutes, you mentioned so many important issues, and I am looking forward to our discussions. We are collecting questions. Just to quickly summarize, you started from a very practical field work of a historian and journalist who needs to access the archive and can benefit from them only if they are opened and available. You mentioned also competition of memories, such a hot topic also today. Finally, what I found really interesting also in the frame of our museum, the House of European History, which tries to embrace different perspectives and to change the perspectives of our visitors who come from their countries, from their national narrative, and want to see a synthesis of European history. So we do provide a suggestion, a proposal, but it is an open proposal to discuss and reflect. So maybe I would like to ask you a question which is very general, because you mentioned the tension between different perspectives, and you mentioned the tension between this Eastern and Western perspective on looking on history, especially regarding the 20th century. So do you find certain motives which are more present in the Eastern and Western narrative, which those two sides should especially embrace and take into account while critically looking at their way of perceiving history?
So thank you for that. It's a very interesting question. It's also very interesting that people understand that there are national narratives, and that the need to overcome those national narratives is quite crucial if you want to actually understand what happened. One of the things I've got used to living in Poland, I'm in Poland right now, is hearing Poles say, oh, nobody knows our history, nobody knows our point of view. And then I ask, when people say this to me, I say, well, how much do you know about Dutch history? And actually, how much do you know about Czech history? And how aware are you of what happened in the Baltic states in 1939 or in Ukraine in 1932? And invariably, they don't know. People become very fixated on how they see the world, how they were taught the history of the world. And sometimes they develop complexes that, we aren't understood, or our version isn't explained. And then they fail to ask themselves how much they do or don't know about other places. I've actually found, as a historian, traveling from country to country and hearing historians speak from their perspective is an excellent way to correct my own mistakes. I, of course, was brought up with an American version of the Second World War and of post-war Europe, and in which we thought of 1945 as a kind of great festival and triumph of democracy. And while to some extent it was, and it's important to remember it that way, incorporating the Eastern perspective, in other words, yes, it was a triumph of democracy for half the continent, but not the other half, was important in helping me understand why politics are the way they are in Eastern Europe, why things look the way they do in Eastern Europe, why the architecture is different. And so, I mean, if there's anything that I would hope your museum can do, it's to give people both, I suppose, a sense of a kind of European narrative, but also to let people see, those different perspectives. I mean, how do the Dutch see it? How do the Danes see it? How do the Italians see it? How do the Poles see it? How do the Lithuanians see it? I mean, if you can show that from different angles, then you begin to get closer to a vision of the whole, and to a better understanding of what Europe itself is and what it could be.
I would like now to ask you a more specific question about your work in the archives, and maybe join it with another question which I heard, which I read appeared on YouTube. I would like to ask you, to what extent the Great Famine, when you access the archives, was recognized by those who produced the archival sources, so the authorities, to what extent they show that they are aware of the situation, and how they write about it. These are the sources that you accessed during your research. But of course, there are other sources which you already mentioned partly in your lecture. And Mari Zarecki is asking if you could comment on Durante's journalism, and then the writings of Welsh journalist Gareth Jones. What do you think of that?
So it's true, in my book, this was, I gave you a couple of paragraphs on Holodomor, and I did write a whole book about it. In the book, I go very extensively into the question of what was known at the time. And the answer is an enormous amount was known, both inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. Stalin received regular reports on the famine and on the situation in the Ukrainian countryside. He understood it very well. There were even there were sort of different kinds of reports he was getting. One source was members of the Ukrainian Communist Party, some of whom were rebelling and against the famine and against this forced removal of food, because the Ukrainian famine was not a natural disaster. It was the result of food being removed from people's homes. And some Ukrainian communists began to rebel against this system and to complain about it and protest and resign from the party and so on. And Stalin had information about that, which he found very alarming. And this may be one of the reasons why there was a crackdown on the Ukrainian Communist Party at the same time, simultaneously with the famine and immediately afterwards. He also had fellow Bolsheviks who were taking trains around the country, who were writing him letters, telling him what they were seeing, which was peasants begging at train stations. And this is, of course, not just in Ukraine, it's in Russia as well. So he had a very good idea of what was happening, very concrete reports from the ground, very clear evidence that he knew. There were also, I should say, letters to him from Ukrainian communists. I mean, these were sometimes more, they often don't say exactly what's happening, although one or two of them does. And they are often pleas for, could he please lower the grain requisitions? Could he please moderate his policy? And these were especially true in the early stages of the famine. And then, of course, these kinds of reports stopped coming as the Ukrainian communists begin to fear for their own lives, and they stopped complaining. So this was very well known. I should say the Ukrainian famine was also known outside the country. It was known, the Catholic Church had reports, the Polish government, the German government, the British government all had reports from the Italian government, I should say, which had an unusual diplomat on the ground who took very good notes. They all had reports from what was going on at the time. And as the questioner asked, there were one or two journalists, famously Gareth Jones, who I wrote about extensively in the book, who was a Welsh journalist who reported what he saw on the ground and actually held a press conference in Berlin describing what happened and what he'd seen. He was, of course, in competition with, as I mentioned, Walter Duranty, who was a New York Times correspondent who, for reasons that actually still remain unclear, decided not to tell that story. Although, again, archives show that he knew the story. There's a British embassy report of a conversation with Walter Duranty that shows him that says, oh, he knows perfectly well that many people are dying of the famine, but he refused to write about it, and he actually mocked Jones's reports. You know, I'm often asked this question, especially by Ukrainian audiences. I've spoken a lot to many of them around the world, Ukrainian diaspora audiences, as well as audiences inside Ukraine, about what people knew and when they knew it. And this, I think, is a really useful reflection point for the present, as we're witnessing a really terrible crisis in Afghanistan, as we witnessed a terrible crisis in Syria a few years ago. We knew a lot, you know, we knew a lot about both crises, and yet, at least in the first case, we did very little. In the second case, you know, we're at the beginning of the story, and it's a very complicated story that doesn't have easy answers. But the fact that people, you know about things and don't do anything about it is actually more common than not. You know, throughout human history, throughout the history of the last couple of centuries, when there have been mass communications and we've been able to understand one another very well, the phenomenon of a tragedy taking place across a border and there being no international reaction is actually quite a common one. The Ukrainian famine is an example of it, but it's not the only one.
Another question, not surprisingly, is touching upon the matter of figures in the context of the Holodomor. Lorenzo Savioni is asking, I visited the Holodomor Museum in Kiev, and according to their statistics, the total death count for the 1932-33 famine in Ukraine runs to at least 4.5 million. So what is your count, and how did you get to establish the figures that you mentioned in your work?
Yeah, so the figures that I mentioned are close to that. I mean, they come from a group of demographers who went back through the archives, not so much the political archives, but the the demographic archives of Ukraine, and made guesses based on how many people should have been born and should have died, and how many unnatural deaths there were throughout the period of the famine. And they get, depending on how you count it and how you splice it, they get a number that's around 4 million, which I think is probably the correct number. The numbers you have to be more careful around are the ones much higher than that, and there are some floating around. And of course, I can't, because we don't have direct counting or evidence, I can't, I can't discount them for good. But they aren't based on anything archival, and the only archives we have tell us the story, which is about the same as the questioner asks.
An interesting question, which we always ask ourselves while observing that witnesses of Soviet crimes, Second World War, are passing away. In your research, I'm quoting, can you comment on how the different generations within the old Soviet bloc look at history in their region? Is the older generation more or less critical of events?
That's an interesting question that I don't have a good answer to. I mean, it's certainly true, and I can say this is true for me, that the experience of having lived through something remains very different from the experience of studying it in a book. And this is one of the reasons why in my book I spent as much time as I could with eyewitnesses or reading the reports of eyewitnesses, just to try to understand how something looked at the time. And of course, what you see at the time isn't the whole story either. And what you see at the time is what you've lived through, and you don't necessarily have the whole picture, you don't have different perspectives and so on. But it means that the events have a greater significance to you. And I do think that there is an important moment of change in Europe that has taken place in the last decade or so, which is the final passing on of the generation that did remember the Second World War. People, the grandparents and even people who remembered it as children are now, very few of them are still with us. And I think that has made a difference to how people listen to and hear when ideologies familiar from that time or language from that time return. It makes them feel differently about how arrangements and adjustments that were made after the war are perceived. I mean, so, you know, the European Union really is the product of a generation of people who remembered the war very well. I mean, all the founders were people who'd lived through it. And of course, for the next 20 or 30 years, they shaped it. And much of its purpose was not merely, you know, it wasn't merely economic or even merely political. It was also a project designed to heal the continent after the war. And I should say that the admission of the former communist states later on was also something that happened because it was done by people who remembered or who were living participants in the Cold War, and they felt a sentiment for that region for that reason. You know, as they move along as well, and as we have a generation who now doesn't remember the Cold War and doesn't, let alone the Second World War, and doesn't remember the communist era, there is this dearth of feeling, or the dearth of, you know, strong memory becomes even more important. It becomes that much easier to manipulate people's memories. It becomes that much easier to use history for current political purposes. I described in my talk a little bit the way that it's done in Russia, but of course it's done in other countries too. And so there is a risk that there's a generational change, and that the forgetting or the lack of the loss of the emotion that people once had about some of these issues is gone. And that's an important challenge for all of Europe, and for those who care about the European Union in particular. You know, how are we going to transmit the memory of the Second World War and the Cold War onto a new generation? How are we going to explain it to people? How do we create that understanding of what a catastrophe it was and why it's so important that it be avoided? How will we transmit that to younger people? It's a very important task. And again, your museum and also the recognition of this day, the commemoration of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, help, I think, a lot in that task.
As we have only around 8 minutes left, maybe I would like to give space to questions which are touching upon the present. So your lecture was very sound in relation to how you expressed history being a tool, or on the other hand, you mentioned that history is being forgotten, and this is also a danger. So Małgorzata Bonikowska from Toronto is asking, as I understand correctly the question, I'm quoting, "Now the world has the internet, which has changed it completely. I guess some things would not be possible now, and some other would be even more dangerous. Any comments on this?" As I understand, it is about the information being transferred through internet.
So, I mean, how the internet has changed the world is a very large question, which maybe we need to do.
Let's concentrate on information being disseminated. Now it's apparently not so easy to lie.
It's very large and complicated question, you know, which I've also written about. You know, obviously the internet has, it's changed the way we perceive history, partly because it gives the impression that history begins when the internet begins. You know, you can't Google things that happened before 1990 so easily. You know, the internet also gives the possibility of creating false documents, which we didn't have before. We did have before, but not in such a simple way. And it gives the ability to create false narratives about history, which are perpetrated in some cases by political groups, in some cases by states. To me, you know, again, this is a much longer subject to discuss, but one of the antidotes to the internet, you know, and to the problems that it's created, is the study of real history, the use of archives, the study, you know, the reading of actual books, and the discussion of history based as closely as we can get it to on sources, on oral history sources, on document sources, on photographs and evidence or pictures from the time. The more that we can do that, the more we can fight against these easy and false visions that are now created and so rapidly disseminated online. So one of the things I'd like to argue for is the kind of archival research that I was lucky enough to be able to do in Russian, which I would not be able to do now. And the engagement in it and the encouragement of younger people to try it and to and simply to, not everybody has to write history, they should also read it. It makes a very useful corrective to the, the very simple version of the world that you encounter often online.
So there is a question precisely about your archival work, which also gives us a possibility to reflect a bit about future of research. So what are the new elements that you found in the Russian archives about the Gulag extermination camps that are different from or add to the information we received from the books, for example, by Solzhenitsyn? And I would add another question: what are the facts that still need to be unveiled, which are waiting for the archives to be accessible?
So to be clear, the archives were accessible throughout the 1990s. The attitude towards history in Russia was that history is unimportant, other things are more important. If some, Western American girl wants to go and read old papers, in the Russian state archives, go right ahead. I mean, I had a lot of access to a lot of archives, and a lot of other historians did too. So we were able to use real documents and information. And again, this question is better answered by my book, but what the archives, as I said in the beginning of my lecture, do is they enable us to be much more precise and specific about what happened. Exactly where was it? How did it happen? How did the Gulag develop as a matter of Soviet policy? Which Politburo meetings made the decisions about it? How did it figure into Stalin's vision of the Soviet Union? All of those things were guessed at, and in some cases accurately, by previous generations of memoirists and Solzhenitsyn, who compiled so much information about the Gulag. But the specifics of it, the details, the dates, the names, the numbers are really only made possible by the archives. And the archives did change the way we understand the Gulag in some subtle ways. I mean, again, the economic importance of it and how significant it was to the economic thinking of the Soviet Union is now clearer. Also, how widespread it was. It wasn't something secret hidden away that most people didn't know about. It was present everywhere, and everybody would have known it all the time. So, and there were prisoners all over the place. And so we now understand that it really was something that was omnipresent in Soviet life in a way that wasn't as clear before. I mean, I could go on about that, but there's allowing the archives have given all writing about the Soviet Union a kind of specificity and clarity that we weren't able to have before. As for what's still left, I mean, look, there are histories of individual camps, of individual people. The KGB archives have still not been fully opened. These have individual case histories. There's a lot more that could be written if the Russian government would give access to archives, which it now unfortunately does not. It's now become much more difficult to use them. Though I should say that there are Soviet archives available in Ukraine, which are open and very usable, very accessible, in the Baltic states and elsewhere, as well as, of course, communist archives, former communist government archives in Poland, Hungary, and so on. So it's still possible to study the communist system, though not in Russia as was possible 15 years ago.
There are many questions which are actually revolving around the situation in Russia today and how you see the future. Just to maybe summarize also our discussion and to look ahead. In your lecture, there was often this term nostalgia. And I would like to quote here Svetlana Boym, who wrote about two types of nostalgia. reflective nostalgia, which is trying to draw conclusions, to look forward, and restorative nostalgia, which is referring and building some vision of the past, which probably never took place, but which is politicized as used as a political tool. So how do you see the situation in Russia today and in the coming years? And also, what would be your appeal, or what would you say, what is the most important factor or the hope for this new interpretation and liberal and reflective interpretation of the past in Russia and in the whole former Soviet bloc today?
With 30 seconds left, those are difficult questions to answer again, but
I think we can extend a few minutes.
Putin's Russia is really the classic example of what I describe in my book, Twilight of Democracy, of restorative nostalgia. In other words, the creation of an image of the great and glorious past, and then the attempt to rebuild that image. So it's not just nostalgia for old churches or old pictures or, you know, some liking to think about the past. It's really a desire to rebuild the past based on a false image. And of course, as I alluded to in the lecture, his image, the moment that he's chosen to celebrate, is the moment of Russian or Soviet, of course, but he's now confused Russian and Soviet, of Soviet imperial triumph. And it's that vision that inspires his fight with Ukraine. It's that vision that inspires his dislike of Western democracy. It's that vision that he's seeking to use to maintain his power and maintain his support, even as Russia goes through, you know, one series of economic crises after another. It's also a vision that's used to hide the nature of the modern Russian state, which is which is profoundly corrupt, even criminal state that, you know, that doesn't act in the interest of the nation, but in the interest of the members of the elite. So history becomes a tool for Putin that he uses to explain what it is that he's doing. It's not there, you know, and to be clear, and I'll repeat something I said before, there are very good historians in Russia. There have been very good books written about Russian history. There have been excellent works of scholarship. There are people who understand it very well. There have been people who worked in the Soviet archives and wrote great papers and made great publications afterwards. But those people for the moment are sidelined. And their discussion of history isn't part of the mainstream conversation. I suppose the hope for the future is that they're sidelined, but they aren't gone. They too have contacts and friends and children and ways of passing on information. I know there are Russian teachers at the school level who have tried to use, you know, the real history of Russia in their teaching. There's always a younger generation that will begin to ask about the past and want to rediscover it. And it's really that younger generation that we have to cheer on and hope that they do.
Dear Anne, thank you very much for this fascinating lecture and for answering questions that we were able to quote during this limited time. I'm sorry that I couldn't quote all of them, but yes, our time is limited. We were joined by people from the United States, from Canada, from South Africa, and Europe, of course. So it is a global community present here. Thank you very much for your presence. And those who have this opportunity to come to the House of European History in Brussels, please feel welcome. And now, thank you everybody once again, and I would like to wish you a pleasant evening. And I think that this discussion will resonate in us for a long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you also for what you do. I wish you best of luck in future.
Thank you.